I've had a lot of interest in these handmade chains that I've been making. This is one that was finished a few days ago, a fairly complicated design. This is a little bit more simple, all made from the same wire units. This is one I finished earlier today, not yet polished, but you can see that all the designs are quite different. What I do is I start usually with bits of copper wire, just to experiment with the various shapes that I'm going to use. There you can see one of the pieces of copper, and I can play around with these on the desk, on the bench, and arrange them into different designs and different patterns, and that way it gives me a good idea of how the finished thing is going to look. What I do is get this wire, silver, this is sterling silver wire, and it's 1.3 millimeters in diameter, and then we're just using where the handle comes onto my cutters, I just slide it in and snip that off, and then cut loads and loads and loads of them. Here's a few that I cut off earlier. And because the cutters have one flush cut and one with a kind of V cut, what I normally do is I take a file and just rub off the ends like so, to make sure that when I solder them, because these are all going to be soldered, that they haven't got this little V shape, particularly from the back end of the cutters. So these have already been cut and filed, ready for the next part of the job. The next part is I take these pliers, which have one round jaw and one with a half round in it, and then I just take one of the wires, and at the very edge of that I will squeeze, twist it round and rotate it until that touches, just until that touches there. Again, there's 2 or 3 that I've done already, so now I have to go through and do all of these individually. So this takes a fair old time, and you have to concentrate, otherwise you get the proportions wrong, and I'm just pushing that to make sure that it touches. So if you want to come back in a wee while and they're all done, you'll see what the next stage. Right, the next stage, having got the wire with one loop on one end, involves just bending the wire over it's actually a metal triblet, but I bend the wire into that shape there, and then taking the same pliers as I put the loop on before, I do another loop on this end, again making sure that it touches when the loop is completed there, and I'll hold it in tweezers so you can see it better, and I make up a link that looks a little bit like that. In fact, I have to make one of these chains as an 18-inch chain. I think it is something in the region of about 40 of those I have to make up, and I keep working through until they're all done. When all the units have been scrolled up, I usually find it better just to give them a wee tap before laying them on the solder block, and to solder all the joints. If I don't do that wee tap, sometimes they're a little bit twisted and they don't solder too well. I like to solder every joint on my necklaces, including these where the scroll swings round and touches the main part of the unit. The reason being that if that's not done, then there's a possibility, well, not really a possibility that it will open because it's quite thick wire, but there's definitely a possibility that clothing or fine fabrics will get jammed in that joint. And so I like to solder everything. It also means that this piece is going to last not just a few weeks, it'll last a lifetime, and that's the way I like to make my stuff. So I'll be tapping away at all these units to flatten them out, arranging them, as I said, arranging them on the block, ready for soldering. And now comes the time-consuming part. This is silver solder. It melts at a slightly lower temperature than the sterling silver, enables you to join it properly. And here you can perhaps see where I've made a little fringe in the end of the solder strip. And now I can cut this into tiny little pieces. I don't know if you're going to see these at this setting on the camera, but there are lots and lots of tiny little pieces that I've prepared here, ready to be put in position onto the joints, which are going to be soldered. And there's a couple of ways I could do this. I could take flux on the end of my brush here and pick up one of those and just place it on the joint. That's one way, but the way I prefer is to use a system called pick soldering. This is a solder pick, and I can literally pick up those bits of solder and place them on as I'm working. I could use one of these little handheld torches, which are very convenient and provide a nice flame, but I actually find, because I've used it for years, I stick to my other torch, or one of my other torches, which is a little bit bigger. And so that joint that I soldered that I positioned a few seconds ago, I can heat that. Always heat the metal surrounding the joint. Don't heat directly onto the joint because the solder will run in the wrong place. And I can just smudge it into place. But the method I like to use now is to pick up one of those, just place the solder pick behind a piece of solder, wait till it jumps onto the solder pick, and then I can position it quite comfortably, and I find that much better. So I can do that again. Incidentally, all of these joints I've already painted with some of the flux which you saw me use on the little brush, and you can see that this is, although it's time consuming, I think it's worth doing this because it does finish the job properly, and each of these pieces is going to be soldered and isn't going to fall apart. I think, as I mentioned earlier, I've got about between 30 and 40 of these to do to make enough for a 16 or an 18-inch necklace. So I'll maybe not bore you by showing you all that soldering. It gives you an idea of how I have to put it together. Well, here we go now. I've already done 3 lots of these, and I'm just going to finish off this last couple on here. This is very tricky because sometimes the solder runs in a different place, and you have to be very precise with the placement of it. I'm getting the hang of this now after all these years. And there it is. You'll notice that all of these have gone quite black. That's silver has oxidized, and so I have to place it in a pickle solution to clean it off. So I just scoosh all of those across there like so. I'll make sure they're all loose, and then drop them onto this wee tray and leave them in the pickle pot, which is just off camera, for a wee while until they all come clean. The reason I've done that is because I'm then going to perform yet another soldering operation, and they won't work very well if there's that oxidation on them. I'll be back in a few minutes. So here we are, these have all come out of the pickle now, and I will need to check, in fact I've checked most of these, to make sure that each of these little joints is actually soldered. There's one or two on the bench here that I'll need to look at again because the solder's not caught. What I have to do now is to go ahead and just reshape this perfectly round shank on these. I like them to be slightly flat, it gives them a little bit more shape, and so I use this slightly curved bench block and just tap away. As you might hear, that makes quite a lot of noise. Even if I put this on the wooden bench, it still makes quite a lot of noise, but just by putting a little piece of leather or a little bit of fabric of some description underneath it, then you'll hear on the next one that it's considerably quieter. And so I go through all of these and tap away just to give that a little shape on the edge, and you may be able to see that there. I don't know whether it's clear enough, but I have to go through all of them, and the less noise I can make, particularly for any of you who have a wife who is a picture framer and her workshop is just through there, then I think she would also appreciate the fact that I can make this a little bit quieter. So tap away for another hour or so. So here we are, nearly there now. There's just 2 or 3 left. I'll just finish them off. So here you can see what the meaning of handmade should be. These are all not bought in components that I've glued together or whatever. These are all entirely handmade. Handmade is not machine made. If they were machine made, they'd all be identical. These almost certainly won't be. They'll be very similar to each other, but they won't be identical, and that's a good way of testing whether something is truly handmade. The pieces may all have slight variations and slight fluctuations in the hammering, the marking, the style, the size and so on, but that's handmade. There's still a couple here that need to be soldered, but I can do those at a later stage. The fun bit comes when you start to play around with these units, and here, I don't know whether that's visible there, yes, just about, you can see that I can arrange these in a whole manner of different patterns. I can turn them round and put them in that position, whatever I want. I can reverse that one and make a completely different pattern. That's one of the joys of making your own units. You can play around until you get a pattern that you like, and just simple alterations like that will make a huge difference. So I'm going to finish these off and get them ready for soldering, because if this was the unit here, I would need to solder there and there. So I'll get them ready onto the soldering block, ready to be put together, and because of the loops that are already in this part of the design, it means that I don't need to solder jump rings onto each one of these. They'll all be joined together with jump rings, but I don't have to solder jump rings onto each individual unit. So bear with me while I arrange them out. So here we are. Here are the units arranged on the soldering block, and they're very delicately arranged. If I touch them, they'll move, obviously, until they've been soldered. And this time I won't use the pick soldering technique. I'm going to take a tiny piece of solder and just place it in position like so, and very gently, trying not to move the units. These others I've already done. There's one that's moved already, you see. So I shall just put some solder in place on that one. Like so. And I'll probably leave that to dry for a minute or two. It does help, because if I put the torch on there now, the flux, which is a paste that I mix up here, which has borax and one or two other bits in it that I've mixed up myself. If I put the torch on there now, the borax will bubble up and the bits of solder will pop off the joint. So these have been done for quite a while, so they may be okay. We'll give it a go and see what happens. I still need the pick. So I just heat gently, not at the joint, but I heat the whole element, the whole unit, so that it all reaches the same temperature. It won't matter. I'm using the same solder as I used on the loops. That won't matter, because now I'm going to concentrate on the joint. And if I move there, you see that one just moved, and that one has just moved in place. So that's now a completely soldered unit. I go again, heat all the elements, heat all the metal, not just at the joint, because that sometimes will make it flow in the wrong direction. I just push that into place and I go right the way through. Oops, just moved that one. Well, there's a classic example. That's stuck together simply by the flux, which is now dried. So then I can go through all the rest of them. It'll take quite a while. There's other sets of units. There's a whole heap down here on the bench waiting to be assembled in that format. But again, I won't let you worry about going through all of those for another hour or whatever. Now that the units are all made, it comes to the point where I have to decide on the configuration of the chain, how it's going to look when it's finished. I have a few options. I could make the two links joined together by two jump rings and a bigger jump ring in the middle, or an even bigger one. I could make that middle jump ring oval. That gives quite a nice effect. Or I could just remove them all together and just join them directly by a single jump ring. This makes for a lot more work, because I've only got one jump ring to solder, and of course it will be soldered. If I put back in this format with 3 jump rings, 2 small ones and a big one, it does mean a lot more soldering, but the result looks really nice when it's done that way. It also adds length to the chain, so I can possibly use less of these units. So I suppose it all balances out eventually. So on this occasion I've decided to put them directly with a single jump ring. This means that I thread the jump ring on here, take the next link, put it on there and close the jump ring up again, because obviously it's not going to solder if there is a gap in the jump ring. And you can see this is very tiny jump rings by comparison to the rest of the work. And I put another link on here, and I continue to do that until I have the chain to the length that I need. So there you can see the chain starting to take form. The reason I've opted to do a single jump ring in this instant is simply because I have another chain not dissimilar which has the other configuration with the large jump ring in between, so this will be a little bit different. Well, now we come to the fun bit. There's my chain assembled with the single jump ring, as I explained. But now, of course, I have to solder all of those individual jump rings. So I'm taking them in these very fine pointed pliers and I'm gripping them in this little clamp, which is called a third hand. because it acts like a spare hand. And there I have the joint of the jump ring right on the top, and I just put a tiny amount of solder on there, and again now I can use my solder pick and I can see the joint, and now I think I can probably use this smaller torch because I'm really only heating the jump ring. I can pick up a little bit of solder on the pick stick, heat the jump ring. It's probably better if I turn the light off because I can see whether it gets hot or not better. There I can see the joint, and just touch on the joint, and that's that solder, that's that jump ring soldered. That won't come undone. I can yank on that chain and it won't come undone. Of course all this is going to be hot, so instead of doing the next one, which would involve quenching this, I just go to the opposite end, which will be cool, and I pick up the joint in the jump ring, again clip it or clamp it in the third hand, a tiny touch of flux, turn on my torch, pick up a tiny piece of solder, and off I go again. And that's the joint made. Of course I then continue for the whole length of the chain, and again that takes quite some time, so I won't bore you with all that detail. But suffice it to say that those links, or at least the one on each end, are solidly soldered and they're not going to pull apart, and I'll show you that when I've finished soldering the rest. So here we are now, all the soldering is completed. The whole thing is really strong, it's not going to break apart. It's now ready to be given its final polish. What I've also done is made a matching bracelet. You can see the little bracelet here, and if you choose to have a longer necklace, then a bracelet hooked onto the end of the chain will make it something like a 22-inch chain, so that it would hang kind of way down here instead of up there. So when that's polished, it'll be ready for the off, and you've now seen how a genuinely handmade chain is made by hand.